Angels or Anunnaki? The definitive proof in the original biblical text. In the pages of the biblical scriptures, we encounter the presence of figures who act as mediators, designated by the term Malakhim. These beings are portrayed acting and speaking as representatives of the Elohim, maintaining various forms of contact with the people of Israel. Traditional theological currents identify these Malakhim as angels, attributing to them, as we will explore in this segment, an elaborate set of spiritual qualities. The field of study known as angelology is dedicated to investigating the transcendental and metaphysical dimension of the existence of these beings. However, a crucial question arises. Do the spiritual and transcendental attributes that angelology, religious devotion, theologians, and classical interpreters associate with the Malakhim actually find a basis in the biblical texts? A direct analysis of the books of Genesis, Exodus, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Tobit, and Zechariah allowed us to reach the conclusion that these beings, popularly known as angels, demonstrate clearly physical behavior, that of corporeal individuals. The Malakhim walk, get dusty, feel tiredness and irritation, require hygiene and rest, eat twice in a single day, choose their places to spend the night, and defend themselves from aggression by means that deserve careful analysis. Their physical distinction is clear. Although they possess capabilities that surpass humans, they are not omnipotent. They demonstrate frailties, can suffer attacks, and are subject to the same physiological needs as human beings. We will demonstrate how the appearance of the Malakhim frequently provoked fear in those who encountered them, their presence rarely being a source of comfort. Many who crossed their path felt that their own survival was at risk. It will quickly become evident that the image of ethereal, positive, and reassuring angels, constructed by religious tradition and still strong in popular faith, lacks biblical foundation. Biblical narratives also distance themselves greatly from the theoretical constructions that came later, which organized angels into complex hierarchies, presenting them as links between human materiality and divine spirituality. Let there be no doubt, we wish to clarify from the outset that our purpose is not to confirm or deny the existence of angelic beings. Our focus is solely to ascertain their presence and the way they are described in the Old Testament, to then confront these findings with what religious and spiritualist tradition in general teaches. Angelology describes different levels of angels categorized by the functions they perform. Each of them would be graced by God with distinct spiritual gifts, such as light, knowledge, or benevolence. Their mission would be to pass on these spiritual gifts to humanity. These figures together would constitute 9 angelic choirs, organized into 3 orders, with each order subdivided into different classes. The highest order includes the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. The second order is formed by dominions, virtues, and powers. The third and lowest order groups the principalities, archangels, and angels. Each of these groups holds its own characteristics, which we will not detail here, with the exception of those pertinent to the orders of angels and cherubim, which are the focus of our investigation. Among the qualities associated with angels, for example, it is stated that they represent access to the Word and are the ideal receptacle of divine light. They would be the vehicles of the power of God to convert sinners, grant wisdom in the revelation of divine secrets, and execute justice by condemning the wicked. They would also be a model to be followed to avoid punishment, dominate vices, and reach heaven, among other things. Faced with such descriptions, an initial and direct realization imposes itself. We are dealing with beings whose physical and behavioral characteristics are considerably less sublime and inspiring than those mentioned in relation to angels and the other celestial orders. Thus, is the totality of what theology wrote about angels sustained by the description of the Malakhim found in the Old Testament? Can we safely state that the theological perspective is in harmony with the events narrated in the Bible? Now, let us examine some passages where angels, or Malakhim, are involved, allowing readers themselves to formulate their conclusions. The patriarch Abram and his wife Sarai could not have children. Even with Yahweh's promise that their descendants would be as numerous as the grains of sand, time passed and Sarai remained infertile. Frustrated with the delay, Sarai suggests that her husband Abram have a child with her Egyptian servant, Hagar. Hagar conceives, which makes her haughty and causes her to abuse her new position to the point where Sarai, with Abram's consent, expels her from the camp. The servant leaves and, while wandering through the desert, encounters a malach, as reported in Genesis 16:7. The encounter with Yahweh's messenger has an air of chance, and the angel Malach himself seems to have been caught by surprise. However, he demonstrates knowledge of Hagar as he addresses her directly. It is clear that the messenger knows who Hagar is, but is unaware of her destination and the reason for her presence there. To him, she should be in Abram's camp, which is why he instructs her to return and submit to her mistress. He, however, comforts her, assuring her that the son she carries will become the ancestor of a great people. It was from Ishmael that the group of peoples known as nomadic Arabs originated. The conclusion of this story is found in chapter 21, where Yahweh deliberates otherwise. Sarai, with divine intervention, finally becomes pregnant and gives birth to Isaac. Yahweh designates him as the legitimate heir and patriarch of the new descendants who would occupy the promised land. This decision brings direct consequences. There cannot be two heirs to avoid conflicts and divisions, and power over properties must not be shared. Therefore, after the birth of the rightful heir, Hagar must leave the camp permanently. Even so, as already mentioned, Ishmael would be the founder of a great nation. It is undeniable that each descendant of Abraham's lineage played a crucial role in the strategic project of the Elohim, who dominated that region of the Middle East. Yahweh needed over time to consolidate a people to occupy and administer the territories designated to him in the division made by Elion. His messengers acted according to a well-defined strategic plan. It is important to emphasize that, in Hagar's narrative, we are facing a concrete fact, not a vision or a dream. Hagar's encounter with the Malach is an unexpected event, but undisputedly real and tangible. The messenger does not descend from the heavens flying nor manifest in a vision. He finds the woman in a precise geographical location, speaks to her personally, and asks her questions that evidence his lack of knowledge about the situation. It is a perfectly normal meeting and dialogue between two real individuals. In chapter 22 of Genesis, Yahweh subjects Abraham to a test of fidelity of extreme hardness and cruelty. He orders him to sacrifice his own son, Isaac. Abraham obeys. He organizes all the preparations for the ritual and heads to the hill pointed out to him. During the journey, however, his son notes, with strangeness, the absence of a crucial item, the victim for the sacrifice. The father, unable to tell him that he himself is the offering, calms him, saying that Yahweh will take charge of providing the victim. Upon arriving at the determined location, Abraham builds the altar, arranges the wood upon it, binds Isaac, and lays him on the pyre. He wields the knife, and exactly at the instant he prepares to take his son's life, according to Genesis 22:11, a malach calls Abraham from the heavens, ordering him to stop the act. The sacrifice is no longer necessary, for the test of loyalty has been passed, and the Elohim now have the certainty that they possess an ally so devoted that he would be willing to sacrifice his son's life. The ritual proceeds, but with a ram that was found and captured at the site. In this chain of events, a clear separation is perceived between two figures, the Elohim, who put Abraham to the test in verse 1, and the Malach, who appears from the heavens to prevent the sacrifice. The entire scene of the dialogue, with its call and response, is impressively effective in its simplicity. The Malach calls out, "Abraham, Abraham," twice, and he responds with "Hineni," which means, "Here I am here." The conversation unfolds and concludes with the renewal of promises regarding the future of Abraham and his lineage. It is noteworthy that God, supposedly omniscient, had no prior knowledge of Abraham's feelings toward him, necessitating therefore a test through a concrete, inhumane, and cruel demand. Only after having confirmation of Abraham's unrestricted obedience does God dispatch a malach, a messenger, to suspend the sacrifice. If the Elohim were capable of reading Abraham's thoughts, this entire passage would become a sequence of purposeless acts. But since God did not know Abraham's mind, he needed to subject him to this trial. His behavior does not differ from that of common earthly rulers who frequently choose to use intermediaries to execute their wills, and so he does too. Thus, the narrative shows us an Elohim unable to decipher a person's state of mind and who resorts to a Malak to intervene in an ongoing action. As anyone can verify by reading this biblical passage, there is not a trace of spiritual connotation, whether in the premise or in the unfolding of the facts. We suggest to our audience that they examine for themselves the biblical passage where Jacob reports having seen in a dream a ladder connecting earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending on it. Often, this scene is interpreted under a ufological perspective. Although we agree in essence with this reading, we insist on sticking to the biblical text, which makes it clear that Jacob was asleep. It was all nothing but a dream. Since it is not our place to analyze dreams, we choose not to issue an opinion on this passage. The viewer, however, would do well to form their own conclusion, consulting the text directly in any translation of the Bible. In the previous excerpts, we observed behaviors that can be considered characteristic of the Malakhim. They played roles as mediators, spokespersons, and executors of orders. Now, we will analyze a circumstance in which the Malakhim are present but remain inactive. It is precisely this inaction that makes the episode fascinating. The event is so trivial that it is usually ignored by analysts seeking the extraordinary. However, experience demonstrates that, often, it is in the details of the mundane that indirect clues of great relevance are found. Jacob had returned to the land of his ancestors in search of a wife. After passing through various trials, he acquires more than one and begins his journey back to the house of his father, Isaac. During this trip, an isolated fact occurs, unrelated to the route and without visible consequences. The presence of this report in the Bible does not seem justified within the grand narrative of Jacob's journey, but it is precisely this peculiarity that makes it so interesting for our analysis. Jacob was in the midst of his journey. Upon sighting the Malakhim, Jacob declares, as a result of this encounter, he chooses to name the location Machanaim, a term frequently translated as if it were a proper name. In truth, Machanaim is the dual form of Mashane, which translates as camp. Therefore, Machanaim means two camps. The scene is portrayed in an extremely vivid and realistic manner. The angels do nothing. They are minding their own business. Jacob approaches with his people and his cattle. The Malakhim move in his direction without saying a word. He recognizes them as messengers of the Elohim and understands that he has stumbled upon two of their camps, deciding then to call the place Machanaim. The etymology of the verb paga, which means to meet by chance, already embeds the idea of casualty or luck, so the narrative informs us, with a clarity that dispenses with interpretations, that the encounter was fortuitous. None of those involved, neither Jacob nor the Malakhim, anticipated it. The presence of the Malakhim, Jacob's realization of having found two camps of the Elohim by accident, and the peculiar way he names the location, Machanaim, or two camps, reinforce the interpretation of the Hebrew exegete Rashi of Troyes, who explicitly describes two military camps protecting both sides of a border. Perhaps it is no coincidence that some members of the troop, the Malakhim, moved to meet the stranger who was approaching. Their simple presence was enough for Jacob and his group to understand that they should not advance further, causing them to resume their journey in another direction. Nothing else happens. The angels do not arrive flying. There are no messages, actions, orders given or executed, nor visions or dreams. The Bible merely records a casual encounter. Some Malakhim approach Jacob without direct contact, and shortly after, each goes their own way. Anyone who has ever witnessed civilians approaching a military area out of curiosity knows that the sentries would act promptly to prevent access. In many situations, the simple sight of the guards already makes it clear that the approach is prohibited. That is what happened to Jacob. If this story is in the Bible, it is because the event marked Jacob. Sighting a camp of the Elohim was certainly not something trivial, and the patriarch kept this experience with appreciation. The Malakhim did or said nothing to him, but the double camp remained engraved in his memory and consequently in the biblical text. The content of Exodus 23:20-30 is of great relevance, as it details the strategy that Yahweh plans to use to conquer the promised land for Moses and his people. A central element of this strategy is the presence of a malach, a messenger, whom Yahweh will send ahead of Moses and the people to guide them and transmit the necessary orders. The Malak will always precede them, and to him they will owe total obedience, as stated in Exodus 23:21. God clarifies that this messenger will be an aid in the conquest, which must occur progressively. The peoples encountered should not be expelled immediately to avoid the abandoned lands becoming deserted and taken over by wild animals. The taking of the land will be, therefore, gradual, occurring at a pace that allows for progressive settlement and the cultivation of the soil for food production. We are, thus, before a God who needs to adapt to the rhythm of nature and the practical needs of a large population moving through unknown territories. He does not perform the extraordinary feats expected of a deity to solve, with his divine power, the challenges that arise in such an undertaking. In verse 27, Yahweh states that he will send ahead of the people his Ima, or terror. It is unclear if this term refers to the messenger himself or to an additional tool. What is certain is that this terror will cause panic among the adversaries, leading to their capture. In any case, Yahweh behaves like a human strategist who sends a commander to lead the troops based on specific and intelligent tactics, which take into account essential logistical aspects. The entire narrative is therefore marked by a strong realism in which the supposed divine omnipotence and angelic spirituality seem to have no place. The Malak, or messenger, and the Emma, terror, will function as operational tools in the imminent war. In the first book of Chronicles, we learn that King David decides to conduct a census, an attitude that displeases Yahweh, in Chronicles 21:1. Let us focus on the part of the report where a messenger is dispatched to annihilate the residents of Jerusalem as a consequence of the king's decision. David addresses Yahweh, reminding him that the responsibility for the decision is exclusively his, and implores that the innocent people not be punished. A curious fact occurs here. God had not immediately realized that the blame for the census lay solely with David. Luckily for the city, Yahweh reconsiders his decision and orders his emissaries to suspend the destruction that was planned. David then lifts up his eyes and sees the Malak, the messenger, 1 Chronicles 21:16. David sees the Malak wielding an object called kerev, a term commonly translated as sword, but whose etymological root refers to the idea of burning or leading to destruction, according to Clark. We do not know what it is, but the Bible informs us that this weapon is netuiah, meaning directed, pointed toward the city of Jerusalem, ready for attack and annihilation. The passage indicates that the messenger was located near the threshing floor of Ornan, Araunah, the Jebusite, inserting the scene into a daily context that resembles nothing like a vision or dream experience. Araunah is threshing wheat with his sons. He turns and sees the Malak. His sons also see him. The sight leaves them so terrified that they hide immediately, 1 Chronicles 21:15-20. This dynamic description is powerful and attests that the appearance and posture of that figure must have been extremely threatening. The incandescent and destructive weapon pointed at Jerusalem provoked panic. Yahweh's messenger interrupts his plan and instructs a man named Gad to tell David to go up and build an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah. David obeys, makes all preparations, and invokes Yahweh, who answers promptly, 1 Chronicles 21:26. The people present witness the messenger sheathing his weapon. The episode ends with an additional observation that makes us reflect. The danger had passed, but in the days that followed, David did not have the courage to go seek Yahweh in his dwelling, which at the time was located in the hills of Gibeon. We have already addressed Yahweh's connection with mountains in chapter 8. Witnessing the weapon of the Malak must have been a frightening and terrifying experience, something never seen before. In the interval between the death of Joshua and the establishment of the monarchy, the nation of Israel was led, at different times, by military and civil figures known as judges. They acted in specific situations to deliver one tribe or another from enemies or from the oppression of neighboring peoples. One of these judges was Gideon. The task of appointing him was delegated to a Malak, who proceeded in a rather peculiar manner. Gideon is threshing wheat when the Malak of Yahweh approaches, stops under the oak in Ophrah, greets him, and communicates the decision to entrust him with the mission of liberating Israel from the dominion of the Midianites. Gideon declares himself unprepared and unworthy, but is encouraged with the promise that Yahweh would support him personally. Still confused, Gideon asks the Malak not to leave, for he wishes to go to his house to fetch food to offer him. The Malak agrees to wait. Let us pause here for two simple questions. Who would consider offering food to a spiritual vision, to an angel? Who would think of requesting a spiritual vision, an angel, to wait patiently while one occupies oneself with fetching food, preparing it, and returning to the meeting place? Gideon then returns to his house, prepares the meat of a young goat and unleavened cakes, finds the Malak who waited for him all this time, and serves him the meal. At that moment, something truly extraordinary happens. The Malak instructs Gideon to place the meat and the unleavened cakes upon a rock, asks him to pour the broth over them, and then, Judges 6:21. The Malak incinerates the meat and the bread and subsequently departs. It seems extremely difficult to us to give this story an interpretation that does not respect its spontaneity and its concrete and realistic nature. Attempting to add or superimpose any spiritual meaning to such a palpable narrative would be ignoring what the text says. The Malak, without a doubt, uses something that produces flames, a notable resemblance to what we will see later in the chapter on Elijah's miracle. There exists a passage in the Bible where the eagerness of religious people to identify an angelic presence at any cost leads translators to insert into the text something that is not even there. In Ezekiel 8:1-13, the prophet narrates an encounter with an undefined something, which modern translations usually render as follows: I looked, and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down he was like fire, and from there up his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven. According to these traditional translations, an angelic figure with human form performs the bizarre and inexplicable act of extending an arm and pulling Ezekiel by the hair to lift him. What peculiar behavior for an angel, but if the story sounds strange, it is because the translation is imprecise. The Masoretic text, in fact, says, Ezekiel 8:2. Firstly, it must be noted that no human figure is mentioned. Something appears resembling the appearance of a man, or fire structure, which emanates a kind of energy like fire in the lower part and has a metallic shine in the upper part. Now, let us analyze the supposed gesture of grabbing the hair. The term tzitzit, normally translated as hair, actually refers to a reinforcement, a fastener of a garment, or even a clamp/lock. Regarding the term ruach, we refer to what has already been said in the chapter dedicated to it. It is worth remembering that this word likely describes something that moved with great speed through the air, and which obviously was not a common bird. Therefore, the biblical text literally informs us that Ezekiel sights a something incandescent and gleaming. This undefined something, in turn, generates or projects another something, which could be described as an object or mechanism with the capacity to lift a human being. It is clear that the most direct way to refer to a gripping tool, difficult to describe, is to compare it to a human hand. The prophet says, the likeness of a hand. The entire ruach lifts the prophet and transports him. We would need to use imagination to visualize a scene that corresponds to this description, but this image is certainly not that of an angel with human form. In the sequence of events, Ezekiel is conducted to Jerusalem, where he observes and exclaims, "There is the kavod of Yahweh." The book of Daniel is part of the so-called apocalyptic literature, and its writing probably dates to the 2nd century BC. Written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, it narrates events that go back to the Babylonian exile, 597 BC. The historical period covered is vast, ranging from approximately 600 to 160 BC. The text presents various inconsistencies of location, content, and language, which causes it not to be classified among the prophetic books in the Hebrew canon, but rather among the writings. The notable differences in structure, form, and literary composition indicate that the book is the fruit of a compilation and revision of existing materials. The various versions of the text show divergences of content, such as the presence of chapters in the Greek Bible that do not appear in the Hebrew one. It is known that apocalyptic literature, unlike historical literature, employs specific resources such as visions and symbolisms, which do not lend themselves to a literal description of reality. Despite this, the book is considered revealed in the Catholic canon and is used to establish angelic figures as truths of faith. Even with all its ambiguities, this book is quietly used as a basis to define dogmas and is widely employed in the elaborations of traditional angelology. It is not surprising, therefore, that we also use it in this context to elaborate hypotheses within our line of independent research. The reason for this is that finding elements of concreteness and narrative realism in a text full of dreams and visions only increases the credibility of the facts we investigate. The less we expect to find them, the more they stand out. The protagonist of the book is Daniel, a Jew who, through visions, transmits the hope of a future in which a Messiah will bring final redemption to his people. It is a kind of theological history of the world in which the certainty is reinforced that God will carry out his plans. Nebuchadnezzar reports a vision to Daniel for him to interpret. Surprisingly, a term emerges in the narrative that reminds us of the presence of well-defined individuals in Sumerian stories, the Watchers. The text states that this being announces a series of decrees declaring that, Daniel 4:14, it is clear, therefore, that there exists a group of individuals belonging to the category of Watchers who are responsible for deciding the distribution of kingdoms on earth. The decision is proclaimed by the Watchers, and the Holy Ones announce the verdict, so that all living beings may know that the Most High has sovereignty over all earthly kingdoms and grants them to whom he pleases. Daniel 4:14. There is no reason to call them angels, nor can they be seen as such if we consider the characteristics that tradition confers upon them. It is important to remember that the Sumerians called their land Kiengir, which means land of the Watchers, and that the Egyptians, since ancient times, knew the Neteru, that is, the Watchers. These are not mere coincidences and deserve attention. Narratives from different cultures speak of individuals who constituted power groups and who received specific tasks, among them that of distributing governments on earth to ensure compliance with laws, as we see in the biblical text we just analyzed. The Greek philosopher Celsus from the 2nd century BC mentions that the first Christians claimed that dozens of these guardians had already descended to earth. We have no way of knowing for certain if the Watcher we speak of is the same figure that appears in Daniel 9:21, identified as Gevriel or Gabriel. Daniel reports that while he was praying during the evening sacrifice, this Gabriel appeared, approached him, and began to speak, claiming to have come to reveal all things to him. Daniel 9:20-22. Our goal here is not to dissect the content of the many revelations made by the messenger to Daniel, but rather to focus exclusively on his figure, especially on a curious detail regarding his manner of presenting himself. Firstly, it is worth noting that the term Gabriel, although commonly seen as a proper name, denotes first and foremost a status, a position, for its meaning is strong man of El. The Hebrew root points to the condition of someone who holds great power. We could imagine him as a high-ranking commander or a diplomatic envoy. His possible elevated position in the hierarchy could be justified by him being, by birth, someone special. In this sense, let us resume a detail from the chapter on the Nephilim. Genesis 6:4 mentions the union between the sons of the Elohim and the daughters of Adam, who, the text states that the children of these crossings were the Gibborim, that is, the strong ones, the powerful ones. Now, Gibborim is the plural of Gibbor. Would it be possible to establish a connection based on the consonantal root between Gevriel and the semi-divine race of the Gibborim? Would he be a Gibbor Gever of El, a man of power descending from the lineage of the Gibborim or the Geverim, plural of Gever? We do not have a definitive answer, but it is impossible not to remember that it was a Gabriel aunt Gevriel who visited Mary, and she conceived Jesus. This biblical passage offers yet another intriguing element. Conventional translations state that Gabriel, Daniel 9:21, arrives flying swiftly. The original expression, however, does not speak of flight. Gabriel arrives. The etymology of Yahaf evokes the sense of struggling to climb, fighting until exhaustion. The comprehensive etymological dictionary also cites this verse and attributes to the verb Yahaf The meanings of to wear oneself out completely, exhausted by fatigue, Klein. Thus, the primary sense of the verb is to make a great effort, to be exhausted, to feel extreme tiredness. Even if he were a Gever, he was not free from the normal physiological functions of a material body that consumes energy when acting. The traditional image of Gabriel as an angel arriving flying with lightness is a pure invention. He was simply tired. In Daniel 10, the prophet has revelations in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus, 536 BC, while he is with other people on the banks of the Tigris River. He lifts his eyes and sees Daniel 10:5-6. This figure possessed hips girded with gold of Upaz, body like the stone of Tarsisk, topaz, front parts like barak, lightning, eyes like laphid, torches of fire, arms and feet like the gleam of Nekoset, polished bronze, voice, sound, like the sound of Haman, the roar produced by a multitude. Daniel 10:6. We notice immediately that this individual is not even called a Malak, but rather an ISC, that is, man. Daniel therefore describes a male individual whose appearance suggests the use of some type of clothing gear, which shines all over and is covered by a linen tunic. This brings us back briefly to Ezekiel, for we find in this passage of Daniel an interesting connection. Ezekiel 9 and 10 narrate the movements of the chariot of God. We cite here 2 verses in which the appearance of the chariot is accompanied by the presence of several people, one of whom resembles what Daniel also describes, Ezekiel 9:2. Just as in the book of Daniel, this person occupies a prominent position. He is also equipped with writing material and receives special assignments in Jerusalem. The text reinforces twice that he is dressed in linen. The similarity between the individual seen by Ezekiel and the one encountered by Daniel in the passage above leads us to believe that we are, very likely, facing a high-ranking officer directly in the service of Yahweh, who perhaps used a uniform to indicate his position. Did Ezekiel and Daniel see the same ISC, the same man? Was he a Gever of El? Did he hold a prominent position in the hierarchy of officers responsible for missions of great importance? Was his function to maintain contact and transmit information to the people chosen to be spokespersons for the Elohim, that is, the prophets? The term prophet, Navi, contrary to popular belief, does not refer to someone who predicts the future, but rather to someone who speaks on behalf of a spokesperson. For more details on the Jewish Roman historian Flavius Josephus and his work, we suggest consulting the glossary. However, we would like to cite here an excerpt from his book, The Jewish War. The report deals with an event with impressive similarities to some of the passages we analyzed when investigating the plurality of the Elohim. Between the years 66 and 70 AD, Rome intervened to suppress the revolts that had broken out in Judea and Jerusalem. The confrontation culminated in the conquest and destruction of the city by the Roman army, led by Titus. The book narrates these events, and Flavius Josephus writes, "A few days after the feast, on the 21st day of the month of Artemisius, a miraculous vision appeared, difficult to believe. Indeed, I believe that what I am about to narrate could be seen as a fable, were it not for the testimony of various people on the one hand, and the confirmation of the calamities that followed on the other. Before sunset, chariots of war and armies of soldiers were seen in the sky over the entire region, emerging from the clouds and surrounding the cities. Furthermore, at the Feast of Pentecost, the priests who entered the inner temple at night for the usual rites reported hearing first a tremor and a noise, and then a chorus of voices saying, 'We are departing from this place.'" 665, 296-299. To whom does Flavius Josephus refer? Why does he insist that what was seen was so extraordinary as to seem unbelievable? Fortunately, there were witnesses, he emphasizes with conviction. The phenomenon is, therefore, unquestionable. Who formed that celestial army? Who are the beings declaring their departure? Were they the armies of the Elohim abandoning their dominion forever? Furthermore, Flavius Josephus records that in an earlier period there appeared in the sky a star resembling a sword and a comet that remained for a year, or when The people gathered for the feast of unleavened bread, Diao. At the 9th hour of the night, the altar and the temple were surrounded by a splendor so intense that it seemed like full daylight, and the appearance lasted half an hour. Sict 5, 289 to 290. We observe an almost chronometric temporal precision in the description of phenomena linked to celestial armies and unidentified presences, accompanied by astonishing events. Perhaps in his time, the Watchers mentioned by Daniel were still present. In popular culture, a wide imaginary and visual repertoire of biblically accurate angels has spread, which bear no resemblance whatsoever to the biblical Malakhim, that is, the messengers that the common translation calls angels. This popular representation also appropriates the descriptions of biblical cherubim, to whom we will dedicate 2 chapters in this book, 14 and 15. As we will see, not even cherubim have anything to do with angels, and much less with biblically accurate angels. Consequently, neither the biblically accurate angels of contemporary visual culture, nor the theological reconstructions, ancient or recent, about angelic figures and hierarchies, nor the conception of angels present in popular devotion relate to the 2 biblical concepts, the Malakhim and the cherubim, with which they are erroneously associated and around which baseless theological, spiritual, and cultural information is built. As we demonstrated in this chapter, the angels or Malakhim in the Bible are beings of flesh and bone, whose physical difference in relation to humans is evident, but, at the same time, unmistakable and undeniable. The Malakhim are more powerful than humans, inhabit restricted access camps, need to ask questions in unforeseen situations, and execute practical tasks. One of these tasks is that of spokespersons for Yahweh, in whose name they transmit orders, provide instructions, and communicate plans that their human interlocutors, the prophets, must pass on to the people. We reiterate that our intention is not to define or deny the existence of angels as spiritual entities, but to understand how they are portrayed in the Old Testament. Given this, let us address the crucial question that emerges from reading the biblical passages presented here. Is what has been written about angels in religious, spiritualist, and devotional literature compatible with the figures of the Malakhim of the Old Testament? We leave this question for reflection, certain that we have provided sufficient elements for everyone to form their own conclusion. We would like to finish with a brief analysis of the New Testament, which proves quite enlightening. In one of his epistles, Paul of Tarsus writes, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing some have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." Hebrews 13:2. Men and angels have similar appearance. Any additional comment would be superfluous. Given what has been presented, the question that imposes itself is not theological, but one of textual coherence. Throughout these analyses, we did nothing more than read what the ancient texts tell us, temporarily suspending the filter of dogmatic interpretation built over the centuries. And what did we find? We found the Malakhim, individuals who eat, get tired, get dirty, who need to ask to obtain information, and whose power, although superior to human, is visibly limited. We found weapons that burn, military orders, territorial conquest strategies, and palpable fear in those who encounter them. All the elaborate construction of angelology, with its 9 spheres and celestial choirs, seems to dissolve when confronted with the rawness and pragmatism of the original texts. The image of the ethereal angel, messenger of unconditional love, simply does not correspond to the portrait of the Malach that emerges from literal reading. Could it be that theologians over the centuries built a castle of spiritual concepts upon a foundation that in truth described commanders, soldiers, and emissaries of a very earthly power, the Elohim? It is not about denying faith or the existence of a spiritual dimension. It is simply about reading what is written. And perhaps the key to all this has always been there, in a simple phrase of the New Testament: "Some welcomed angels without knowing." How would that be possible if they were not indistinguishable from a common human being? The conclusion, as always, I leave to everyone's reflection. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support us and become a member to get exclusive access to audio versions of our material. This helps us a lot. Don't forget to activate notifications so you don't miss any content. Until next time.